beginning in December 1941, the United States joined the war against the Axis powers. The main Axis powers, again, being Germany, Italy, and Japan. So we're going to talk about U.S. fighting these various powers in a little bit here, but I'm going to start out with how the U.S. is going to impact the war from home and how the war is going to impact the United States at home. So what effect is the home front going to have on the war, and how's the war going to affect the interior of the United States? Well, the obvious thing that the U.S. is going to contribute to the war from home is manpower. So as we talked about before, the United States had already started the draft. They'd had the selective service, and they had started recruiting men into the various armed forces. So you already had a small army built up, or at least bigger than the United States standing army normally is. But you need even more men to fight. Well, you'll sometimes see, movies and stuff portray it as Americans were scrambling to join the war. I think it was the latest Ken Burns documentary said that people were killing themselves when they couldn't join the military. That's true to an extent. You are going to see Americans lining up to join at least one of the armed forces. And this one armed force is going to have a lot of recruits is going to be the Navy. A lot of Americans, when war's declared in December 1941, see the attack at Pearl Harbor, and it's almost like a personal attack on the United States. And so you legitimately will have Americans lined up to join the Navy beginning in December 1941. You're not going to have as many wanting to join the Army, in particular because a lot of Americans view it as, hey, this is going to be a naval war against Japan, who attacked us. Less Americans are enthusiastic about fighting Germany. Now, they understand once war is declared against Germany and Italy, we need to go to war with them, but Americans aren't going to view them as the ones that attacked the United States. So you're not going to see this almost like vitriol or this we have to get revenge against them. And because of that, the United States Army is not going to have enough recruits coming in to join it. So what the United States will have to do throughout this war is increase the number of men drafted. So this isn't going to be like the draft that I think a lot of people are familiar with. Basically, you are going to see during the Vietnam War this lottery system where everybody registers for the draft, and if your number comes up, you have to go serve. This isn't exactly the same. The way the draft is going to work during World War II is it initially starts out as, before the war, as men of a certain age. I don't know the exact numbers, let's say 18 to 22, who are not poor, who don't have anyone depending on them, who aren't married, basically will have to join the Army. Well, when the Army's not able to get enough men through this draft method and not enough people volunteer for the Army, again, no matter what grandpa or grandma says, you're not going to have people knocking down the doors to join this war. You do have a lot of people join, but not enough to meet the manpower demands. What the U.S. will start doing is getting rid of some of those exemptions for the draft. So it will say that even if you're married, you have to join the draft. Even if you have a certain amount of dependents, you have to join, until by 1943-44, even somebody who's married with a couple kids can be drafted in a certain age, and they'll expand the age range as they go along. So as a matter of fact, most people that serve in the armed forces in World War II are going to be drafted. It's not like everybody is enlisting, but basically if you meet certain conditions, you're going to be drafted, and that's how they're going to meet their numbers. You can get exemptions from the draft for other things. Like I had one of my grandfathers, he was drafted. Other grandfather was he got an exemption because he worked in chemical manufacturing, and so they needed that for the war effort. So you'll see people drafted. You also see people enlist, but it's not everybody rushing to enlist, as you'll sometimes hear older people say. So when you're increasing the size of the military, and at the peak of World War II, you're going to have some 16 million people serve in one armed forces or another. This obviously means new bases. You need new places for these people to train. So what we're going to see is bases start popping up throughout the United States to train these various soldiers, sailors, and to perform other things that needed for World War II. So what happens is, again, you had U.S. military bases throughout the United States, but with the increase in the military, you need something to train pilots. So what you'll see is the federal government's going to go out and it will either find federally owned land or sometimes buy land on the cheap from a rancher or something like that. And you'll see these little bases pop up throughout the U.S. A lot of places, there had been almost no population in a location prior to the war, but the second war starts, you get a base formed, and then you're going to have tons of people moving there, and then obviously the people on the base need somewhere to go to drink beer, or you need food for there, and so you'll start seeing goods and services, and you'll see towns that were small before the war now become big during the war. This is one of the ways the war impacts the U.S. Places like, for example, Marfa in West Texas, nobody lived there prior to the war. Base gets built during the war, and we see the population increase. Places like Wichita Falls, population dramatically increases because of military bases. And we're going to see a lot of new military bases, in particular being created in the South where land's cheap, and in the plains area where land's not only cheap, but you can train pilots because, not having to worry about crashing in a mountain. So we see a lot of plains towns essentially pop up because of the war. All right, so you got a lot more people you're training it. I should also point out you're going to see some naval bases as you now have to worry about German submarines because they're going to be directly preying on American shipping. And so you'll see things like blimp bases popping up to watch for German submarines up and down the coast. Same thing on the Pacific to watch for Japanese attacks, and you'll see those pop up and down. So the United States, a lot of military bases formed because of this war. All right, so U.S. is contributing men, and the training of men is changing the United States. Other things that are U.S. is going to contribute, and this is probably one of the main ways the U.S. is going to contribute to the war, is in terms of food and raw resources. So, United States, if you're sending men to war, these guys need to be fed. And this is a problem because the guys that are going off to war, a lot of them are being drafted, and they're leaving positions in agriculture. So you take a farmhand and you send him off to war. Now you got to feed this guy, but you have one less farmhand. And you actually have to feed him more than you normally would. The U.S. is going to adopt this approach where a well-fed soldier is a better soldier. So the more calories, the more protein soldiers get, the better they're going to fight. So you're going to have to give this guy, I think the number was 4,500, 6,000 calories a day. And now we got to provide this. Well, what the U.S. is going to do to meet some of this increased agricultural demand, one of the things they're going to do is they're going to be looking for workers to replace the people that have just left. So the United States will actually form an agreement with Mexico. So Mexico, during the Mexican Revolution, we saw a lot of Mexicans move to the United States, start living in places like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, working in agricultural positions. Well, a lot of these families had moved to the southwestern United States are actually going to be forced to return during the Great Depression as local and state governments deported them, even people that were actually born in the United States during the Great Depression, because the idea is we need jobs for Americans. Well, now the United States needs workers for these fields. So what the U.S. will essentially have to do is go to Mexico and say, can we make an agreement to where you send workers over to the United States so they can work in these fields? We need the workers now. Well, Mexico's a little bit hesitant because of the treatment that Mexicans got during the Great Depression. So this agreement will be made that Mexico will recruit workers within Mexico. They're going to go to the United States and they'll report to these border stations. And when they get to these border stations, there's going to be these bracero workers. Essentially, this bracero program will be where Mexico recruits workers, gets them to the U.S. border. They meet then with agriculturalists, farmers who need laborers, and then when they get these laborers, they're going to the farmer will take the workers off wherever farm work needs to be done. So you're somebody who is growing tomatoes. I always use that as an example here in North Texas. All your workers have gone off to war. Well, you go to the border and you're going to recruit, say, 20 workers. You bring them back there. They're going to work for the season, sometimes more than one season. At the end of their time, you bring them back to Mexico, and then they get paid not by the farmer, but by the Mexican government. So what happens here is the farmer pays the United States government pays the Mexican government, and the Mexican government pays the workers. And this comes from Mexico's fear that farmers would take advantage of the Mexican workers because of the language issue. And it had happened before when Mexican workers had gone across. So this bracero program is going to fill the need for these agricultural workers in the United States. And you'll see braceros brought throughout the United States. And now during the Mexican Revolution, it was primarily here in the Southwest, but you'll see braceros brought to places like Wisconsin, Michigan, things like that. Tony Romo, the former quarterback of the Cowboys, I believe his great-grandfather might have come over as a bracero. You'll see a Mexican population in Oregon and Washington because a lot of the farm laborers there were of Japanese descent, and as we're going to talk about in a little bit here, those Japanese workers, something's going to happen with them, so you need replacement workers, and that's going to be these Mexican workers. So whereas World War I and the Mexican Revolution brought Mexican workers to the Southwest, you see Mexican workers brought throughout the United States with this bracero program. Bracero program is actually going to continue after the United States is over. Fun, interesting thing here, well, it's not very fun, but a lot of the workers, after they return to Mexico, the Mexican government, there's some corruption there. The workers don't get the pay they're entitled. So if you have a grandparent or something that was a bracero and they could prove they're bracero, there's actually a lawsuit against the Mexican government where the Mexican government paid any bracero something like $10,000. So if you have a grandparent that can prove they're bracero, they'll get $10,000 from Mexico. All right, so you have these workers, they're meeting these agricultural demands, you're starting to feed soldiers, but the problem is, even then, the United States is still going to be short in items that they want to feed these soldiers, particularly things like meat, okay? So you're not going to have enough meat to feed soldiers, and certain vegetables, you want to provide to the soldiers so they fight better. So what the United States will actually do during World War II is it's going to institute something called the Ration System. All right, so Americans will be issued by the government ration cards, and what these ration cards will be is you go to the store, and certain items that they need for soldiers over there, let's say steak, certain vegetables that are needed, by soldiers over in the war. Let's say you want a steak. Well, the U.S. government might put a high ration number on it because they don't want civilians buying the steaks when they want to send them to the soldiers, but they don't want to completely prevent civilians from getting them. So what they might say is that in order to buy a steak, you've got to give, and I'm making this number up here, but 12 ration stamps for a steak because it's something that we need for soldiers. Say carrots or something else that soldiers need and demand for. If you want to buy carrots, you got to trade in 4 stamps. You also have to pay for it, but basically this is this is a means for to keep allowing civilians to get these items, but also to limit how many of certain items they can get to allow soldiers to get more of them. So the shop owner would be expected to collect the number of ration stamps per the certain items he's selling. Now, if you knew the store owner, he could maybe look the other way and not collect as many ration stamps or something like that. And there are certainly ways to get around it, but most people are going to abide by this ration system. U.S. will encourage people, okay, let's say you really want a steak and sure you can use a ration on it, but we encourage people to have things like Meatless Monday. So in order to reserve this food for the soldiers, why don't you just not have meat on Monday? And if you want certain vegetables, why don't you plant a victory garden, is what they would call it, in your backyard, and instead of buying carrots or whatever at the store, you can get them from the backyard. So the U.S., in order to supply the needs of soldiers going off to war, will start this ration system, and Americans for the most part will abide by it. Now, if you do that today, I can imagine, how dare you, government, try to tell me what I can and can't buy, and there'd be a lot of protests for it. But overall support for the war, especially after Pearl Harbor, people will follow this ration system. There's also the government will, in some cases, very much limit what can be sold to the public, and it's going to put out propaganda essentially asking the public not to use certain items, or if you have certain items, to sell them to the government, or to just don't use them, or donate them to the government. So if you look at walls and cities and stuff, you might see a poster like this: when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. So what it's basically insinuating here is that if you have to get to work, you're driving in with your car, normally you and your neighbor take separate cars. Why don't you ride together? And the thought here would be you save certain items which are needed overseas. And from this picture, you would kind of guess that maybe gasoline needs to be reserved. Now, that is true. That is true. The United States need gas for tanks, planes, things like that. So it doesn't want Americans driving all over the place. But actually, at this time, the U.S. produces a lot of gasoline. So it's not gasoline they're worried about with this this poster. What they want people to drive less for, primarily, again, other things, but primarily they want people to drive less to conserve rubber. So the U.S. is going to do this with a lot of different items, but just to show how the war is going to create problems and force the U.S. government to ration and do this propaganda, I'm going to focus on one, and that's rubber, because I think it's kind of an interesting story, and it kind of shows how the world gets connected during World War II. So if you know anything about rubber, it comes from a tree. This tree is native to South America. I think there's a couple in Central America, but right here in Brazil is where the heart of rubber comes from. Well, rubber, prior to European colonization, when it was American Indians only in this area, you would see it be used for balls, for this ball game they would play in the Andes and Mesoamerica. You would see these rubber balls being used. Well, the Europeans come over. They initially don't have a use for rubber, but then the automobile starts becoming popular, and Henry Ford realized that in order for the automobile not to shake apart, in order to maximize efficiency, you needed tires made of rubber. Well, Henry Ford in the early 1900s is going to start growing, or is going to start importing rubber from Brazil. So the way that this is going to work is you would have these hunters, rubber hunters or rubber trappers, go into the Amazon in Brazil. They would walk half a mile between rubber trees. They'd find them, they'd tap them, they get this liquid rubber out. And these trappers are going to be incredibly inefficient, because you'd have to go into the Amazon for months on end to get a lot of rubber. And then you come out, you get some rubber, then you put this on an American transport ship, you sell it up in the United States. Rubber doesn't grow very well in the U.S., so it's not like Henry Ford can grow the rubber trees himself. Well, this is the way it starts, but then as automobiles become more popular, the demand for rubber goes up. So rubber trappers have difficulty meeting the demands of rubber. So Henry Ford, he's actually going to get in his mind to run rubber plantations in Brazil. What he does is he buys a huge chunk of land in the Amazon, and he's going to start building this Fordlandia, is what he called it. And he's going to bring in American workers, and these American workers are going to be put up in American-style homes, and they and Brazilian workers will plant rubber trees in essentially a plantation style. So whereas the rubber trappers would have to go out and find natural rubber trees, and again, these things are growing far apart, the Henry Ford's Fordlandia is going to put these things right beside each other. So instead of a rubber trapper inefficiently going out for a month to get, I'm making these numbers up, but a barrel of rubber, you can get that same amount by tapping this tree, tapping this tree, tapping this tree. You can get that same amount in the morning. So it seems like this is a great idea. Well, unfortunately for Henry Ford, the rubber trees, one of the reasons that they grow apart is because If there's a disease, then it passes really easily from one tree to another. That actually happens with the plantations that Henry Ford sets up. The rubber trees get a disease, they pass it to one another, and all these trees stop producing rubber because they get this disease and they die. So Henry Ford's going to be left in the 1930s with insufficient rubber. Well, there's another source of rubber, thankfully for Henry Ford, and this is going to be in Indochina. Right here, France had illegally taken rubber trees out of Brazil in the 1800s. They put it here in their colony of Indochina, and so Henry Ford was able to get rubber from Indochina from the French in the 1930s. So even though his plan failed here and he's not getting sufficient rubber just because the way it works down here, if they're natural rubber, there's simply not enough, it's inefficient. But we can do that over here because the disease isn't over here. So he starts getting it from these French plantations in Indochina. Well, what happens to Indochina? 1940 gets taken over by Japan. 1941, Japan goes to war with the United States, stops trading rubber to the United States. So now you have Henry Ford. He has no more rubber because not getting enough from Brazil because can't have the plantations because of disease, and now Japan has shut off rubber shipments to the United States. And making things even more problematic is that Henry Ford and other American automobile manufacturers are now going to see their factories opening up. We'll talk about this more in a second, because the United States government is going to be demanding them to produce vehicles for the U.S. And so now we need this rubber. Where do we get it? Well, fortunately for these American automobile manufacturers, somebody had been experimenting with artificial rubber. And what that was is you would take petroleum oil and you could turn that into rubber. Unfortunately for these automobile manufacturers, the people that are using artificial rubber and developing the techniques that allow you to create tires out of artificial rubber, they all happen to be in Germany, and so they're going to shut their factories to the United States in 1941. So as a result of this crazy rubber mess, what you'll see is that the government is simply going to tell people, stop driving because we don't want to wear you down your tires. If you have rubber fishing boots, please donate them to the U.S. government. And this is just one sort of way that you're going to see this demand for resources and labor shortages hit the United States. And again, that's rubber. You can see similar things happen with steel, copper, that type of thing, as the U.S. has to find end arounds, ask the people, American public, to donate things and to cut back on certain items. All right, so the U.S. is contributing by supplying raw materials, supplying food. It's having to sacrifice in certain areas. Probably the main way that the U.S. is going to contribute to the war effort is going to be in industry. So the United States had eclipsed Britain in industry in World War I, and in the 1920s, U.S. industry had grown exponentially. U.S., good at automobiles, all this type of thing. A lot of these are consumer goods. Well, 1929, the Great Depression hits. People stop buying. When they stop buying, a lot of these factories shut down. Henry Ford, just as an example, had to close a lot of automobile manufacturing plants because during the Great Depression, nobody wants to buy a car because they're out of a job or they're afraid they're going to be out of a job. Well, 1941 hits. The federal government is now sending men off to war. In order to get money to pay for vehicles for these guys, we'll see FDR and the Democrats are going to increase taxes on the wealthy up to 90% of their income. They'll start selling bonds at increased rates. And what they're going to use this money for is to write checks to people like Henry Ford, and they'll say, fire up those factories, and instead of producing automobiles, produce tanks, produce planes, produce jeeps, produce weapons of war. Now, you'll sometimes hear World War II gets the U.S. out of the Great Depression. It's actually government spending in World War II. So the government's going to tax so much and borrow so much, then write checks that American private companies go to work for the United States, and they're going to put their workers back to work. So we'll see all this industry reemerge, and we'll see these factories start pumping out these machines. And because the U.S. is the leader in industry, it's going to produce much more than any other nation, whether on the Allies or the Axis. As a matter of fact, we're going to talk about this more. If you were to look at the main contribution to Allied victory, it's going to be machines. The U.S. is going to provide machines not just for its soldiers, but through the Lend-Lease program, provide them to Britain, Soviet Union. It's also going to send weapons of war over to China because they're still fighting Japan over there. And the U.S. is going to be producing, obviously, naval ships, submarines, and the U.S. is going to be better at this than any country. They already have these assembly lines, these factories in place. It's just now they're making weapons of war. So U.S. industry is just going to, emerge and become this the major contribution that the U.S. has in the war. U.S. because they're not being constantly bombed, so Britain's right on the edge of, German-controlled France, so the Germans are sending bombers throughout the war. The British, they're going to come up with some advancements. I mean, Scotland's going to be fairly isolated, but the U.S., outside of a couple things we'll talk about later, essentially they're not getting bombed. So the U.S. can start experimenting with these technologies that other countries can't experiment with, and their factories aren't going to be bombed like British factories or like German or Russian factories. And so what you'll see is the U.S. starts producing these highly technologically advanced machines like this thing. This is a B-29 bomber. It's pressurized, which means you can fly even higher than anti-aircraft weapons can hit. And U.S. factories will just start churning this stuff out. Now, obviously, and we talked about this before with agricultural workers, people that might have worked in industry, they're now going off to fight in the war. They've been drafted. Who's going to be producing these machines? Well, not everybody's drafted. Some people are going to be deemed as essential to running the factories, but you'll see that obviously still are going to have some holes in these assembly lines. So, who will fill it? Well, that will be a lot of cases women. Women will be expected to work. Now, as we've talked about before, you did have women working in the late 1800s, usually until they were married. Then once you get married, you become a homemaker. And then in World War I, we did see an increase in women in the workforce. As men go off to war, women serve in industry. And this had led to dramatic social change and political change. Right after World War I is when women got the right to vote. Women started contributing to the economy. They're making money, so they're able to purchase things they hadn't purchased before. But during World War II, you actually see this number go up of women in the workforce, the percentage go up even further than it had in World War I. So before the war, women made up about 25% of the workforce. It's not going to shoot up significantly. It'll shoot up to more than 30%, but that is going to be a pretty significant increase for a short amount of time. The differences between the increase in women in the workforce in World War I and World War II, though, is going to be not in political or social. We don't see women make social or political gains as much as we did in World War I. But one thing you will see is that because World War II is going to last longer than World War I, there will be more women who get used to working. So World War I, U.S. is in it for less than 2 years. So that's only, even if you were a woman, you started working at the beginning of the 2 years, the men come back, you lose your job to them. Well, during World War II, you got more women in industry, and you've got them working for 3-4 years. A lot of these women, even when the war's over, they've started to identify by their work. Like, I am an industrial worker. This is a part of who I am. I like to work. I don't want to go back home even when this guy comes home. So you will see an increased number of women after World War II who want to continue working. They start identifying themselves by their work like a lot more men had. So again, not the social change that you're going to see in political change like you saw after World War I, but you do see some women identify themselves with work more in World War II. This is a sort of propaganda poster from the time encouraging, women, hey, industry, if they factory near you has jobs open, consider applying for the job. we can do it. This is Rosie the Riveter. This is actually a different version of Rosie River than you'll see sometimes. Sometimes you'll see this version where she's sort of like Brienne of Tarth from Game of Thrones, just a powerhouse. I don't know. I think I kind of like that version a little bit better. She looks really tough. So this is one way the U.S. is contributing to the war with industry, and the war is changing the U.S. at home. Another way things are changing and the U.S. is contributing to the war from home is all these items that are produced in industry, U.S. is going to have to ship them across the Atlantic. Well, Germans, now that the U.S. is fully in this thing, they're going to start to, these U-boats will start blowing up U.S. ships as they go across the Atlantic. U.S. is going to have to start coming up with these methods to destroy these German U-boats. And we're going to have this Battle of Atlantic. It's going to be especially harsh in 42 and 43 as these convoys go across. The U.S. will have to find ways to defend against these German subs. But eventually, it's going to get to the point where something like 80% of German subs will have been sunk by the end of this war, and this is going to be by 44 and 45. The submarine threat is going to be much less significant, as essentially U.S. supplies are going to be able to reach Europe fairly easily. So that's one way the U.S. can contribute to the war is through these convoy efforts. Another way the U.S. is going to contribute to the war from home is in terms of diplomacy. So FDR, as we mentioned, runs for a third term and wins. Well, he's going to join the British and the Soviet Union in fighting Germany. Now, United States is going to be basically decided this thing that the U.S. is going to mainly focus its efforts in 42 against the Japanese, but it is going to, be sending some men to Europe and North Africa to fight the Germans. And when the U.S. gets involved and FDR starts talking to his allies, he's going to quickly find that his allies don't really like each other, okay? So the way that Stalin, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, looks at Winston Churchill is he looks at him as an imperialist. This is an imperialist that colonized the world, took advantage of his people, capitalist, basically feeding into the hands of the ultra wealthy at the top. And the way that Churchill looked at Stalin is this guy is also an expansionist. He's aggressive. Remember, he invaded Poland at the same time Germany did. He's a guy that killed all his political opponents. He's a butcher. And Churchill doesn't like communists, so this is a communist dictator, anti-democrat. And then again to Stalin, this guy's an imperialist, capitalist. They hate each other, okay? They don't like each other. And before the U.S. gets involved, these guys are allies, but they didn't really work together, which is problematic because, if the Soviets are having a problem with the Germans and, the British aren't helping them, they could be both fighting the Germans, but they could actually be hurting their efforts against the Germans by attacking different targets. Well, to better coordinate things, or the U.S. is going to end up better coordinating things because you're going to get FDR stepping in through correspondence and actually meeting with these guys on a couple occasions. And what he's going to do is serve this role as mediator, okay? FDR, as we talked about, he's got a very good temperament. He's good about, picking his words. He's good about reading people. So what'll happen is, these guys will be sending FDR letters and telegrams, and a lot of times these guys are going to be speaking out against the other guy. And FDR is going to be writing back like, no, remember that the Germans are our enemy here. We need to work together. And when these guys meet, they're going to meet on a couple different occasions. For example, in 43, they'll meet in Tehran to discuss the war effort against Germany. These two guys, Stalin and Churchill, they start arguing. They start yelling at each other. Stalin at this point wants the British to be attacking a certain area. Churchill doesn't agree with Stalin. And these guys essentially are at each other's throats. Well, what FDR is going to do is realize both these dudes love booze. Both these guys love booze. And so he's going to get some vodka or some whiskey or something like that. And he's going to come out, guys, I got some booze. Let's get drunk and talk about it. And apparently, after getting these guys all drunk, they'll actually become friendly and I love you, man. And then they'll start coordinating better against fighting Germany. I don't know if that story's true, but it is generally true that FDR is going to serve as this mediator to the Allies. Okay, so the United States contributing in terms of diplomacy. How else is the U.S. contributing? Well, U.S. is going to serve as home to POW camps. So what happens is, during the war, what happens to Germans that are captured in battle? Well, some will be sent to Britain, but some, particularly those captured in warm weather areas, the rules of war basically dictate that you've got to put somebody captured in a warm weather area in somewhere that's warm. Well, it's not warm in England, so those Germans captured in North Africa, let's send them to places like Texas. And you'll see throughout the United States, these prisoners of war camp will open for German prisoners. So German prisoners will be put on these ships, sent over to places like Central Texas. We see a lot of prisoner of war camps there, and they're going to be put to work at these various camps. Now, way these camps will work is the prisoners of war, they're not going to be punished. They're not going to be mistreated. And as a matter of fact, the guards of the prisoners are going to have to live in the same conditions that the prisoners live in. So if you have POWs sleeping in just these tight quarters where everybody's sleeping on top of each other, hypothetically the guards would have to live in those conditions. So they don't do that. So what they do is they give prisoners fine bunking accommodations. They give them good food, and they actually pay them for their work. Now, this might sound crazy. Why would you pay a German prisoner for work? Why would you give them good living conditions, good food? The thought behind this is that if you treat German prisoners well, then they're going to treat your prisoners well. So if you got Americans, they're going to start bombing, using these planes to bomb out of England into Germany. When those planes get shot down, you don't want your pilots to get killed, to be treated poorly. So you want to make sure that Germany sees you're treating their POWs well. Same thing, Italy, catching Italian soldiers, same thing. So you want to make sure that they're get good accommodations. This might sound crazy, but it's going to save a lot of American POW lives, because what happens with Germany and the Soviet Union, they hate each other. So when they capture each other, one side will kill their prisoners, while the other side sees that they kill their prisoners. And so you'll get these instances where one time, my numbers might be a little off here, but 60,000 German POWs are captured. They're sent to these gulags in Siberia and Russia. Only 5,000 survive. The Germans, they'll essentially put Soviet prisoners in these concentration camps, not feed them enough, and you'll see millions of Soviets die of these horrible conditions in these concentration camps. You don't see that with American prisoners. Now, I don't want to say it's nice or anything like that, but because you have this, I'll treat your guys okay, you'll treat my guys okay. Kind of interesting thing is there's almost no attempted escapes of German prisoners in the United States, because what's the point? You're being treated well. One, you're being treated well. Two, where are you going to go? So let's say you escape, maybe make your way to Mexico. Hypothetically, you catch some in Mexico, get back to Germany. What's going to happen to you then? Oh, well, good job escaping. Now I'm going to send you to the Eastern Front, where you're going to be killed by a Russian soldier. So first of all, why would you escape? Second of all, if you did escape, getting there is difficult, and then when you did get there, you're rewarded by dying. So most prisoners are going to say, I'm going to be fine here. And as a matter of fact, some prisoners, as sort of a reward for good service, they'll actually be given weekend passes in near the prison camp. So what you actually see here in Central Texas, you have these POW camps. You'll get good acting German prisoner, not afraid he's going to escape. He goes out for the weekend and meets fellow Germans. There's a big German population in Central Texas. These are probably third, fourth generations at this point. But you go out and you go get to restaurants. You're using the money that you're earning there. One of these sort of crazy, gross things that you see as a result of this is that sometimes you'll have German POWs. Sometimes members of the Nazi party go out and they get dinner at a restaurant, and then you'll have a black serviceman for the United States go into the same restaurant. The German POWs will be allowed service because of their skin color. The German or the black American servicemen will be denied service. So that's incredibly gross, like how that happens. These German prisoners, some of them are actually treated so nicely they apply for German or American citizenship after the war. All right, so this is some of these camps set up throughout the United States. Some of these camps are not going to be for POWs. Some of the camps set up throughout the United States will be for American citizens. So very shortly into the war, FDR is going to make a decision that's going to haunt his administration. It's going to be viewed by a lot of historians as the biggest mistake of his administration. FDR will determine, and there is some truth to this, he's going to determine that part of the reason the attack on Pearl Harbor was so successful is that Japanese citizens of the United States in Hawaii were spying for Japan and telling them the best time to attack, giving them a layout of Pearl Harbor, that type of thing. And there actually were some people of Japanese descent in Hawaii that had given this information to Japan. Well, again, this is just a small percentage of the population. Japan had the people of Japanese descent, a large population in Hawaii. So you have this small part of the population. Well, FDR is going to make the decision that Japanese citizens, or not even citizens, just people of Japanese descent in areas that we believe are under threat from Japan cannot remain where they are. Now, this isn't going to be Japanese citizens everywhere. They're actually going to determine there are too many Japanese citizens in Hawaii to carry this out. But Japanese citizens in places like, coastal Washington, coastal Oregon, coastal California, we are too nervous about them giving information to Japan. So we are going to order that they have to report to these internment camps. And you'll see these Japanese internment camps. And as you see here, there's going to be a handful of Germans sent to internment camps, German American citizens sent to internment camps, but it's mainly going to be people of Japanese descent. So let's imagine you are a Japanese citizen in, say, Portland. The U.S. is afraid of Japanese attack there, something like that. And you're basically given a notice that you have to report to this internment camp, or you have to report to this bus that's going to be taking you to this location for the course of the war. You don't know how long the war is going to be, and let's say you're running a shop, you have a house, and you basically have 7 days. If you resist this 7 days, then per executive order, you're going to be guilty of a crime, treason. I'm not sure the specific crime, but you can be thrown in jail instead of this internment camp. Now, the United States will say, when you get to the internment camp, you're going to be treated fairly, but you're not going to be able to leave for the course of the war. What are you going to do in this 7 days? You got to sell your house. You got to get somebody to run your business for you. A good chunk of time, 7 days certainly isn't enough for that. And now let's imagine maybe this is going to be, maybe you've just arrived from Japan a couple years before, but the United States will apply this to people that have been in the United States for generations. Maybe you were born in the U.S., your mother was born in the U.S., your grandfather was born in the U.S., great-great-grandfather arrived in 1870 or something like that. But now you're being told, because of your ancestry, you've got to report to this internment camp, and you're not able to find somebody to watch your shop, or you're not able to sell your house. So you're forced to leave here. You're going to be brought to these internment camps, and you're going to have to remain for what turns out to be 3 years. Now, these internment camps, and by the way, a lot of times when that happens, what will happen to that store, it becomes abandoned. People will use squatter laws to claim it. Your house, will be sold off or something. The city will reclaim it. But now you're going to be in these internment camps for 3 years. Now, this is nothing like these concentration camps we're going to talk about. It's not like what we saw with the camps in the Philippines where, thousands of people died. It's not anything like that. And as a matter of fact, you're going to be given an education. Kids will go to school. They'll have barber shops and things like that. But you can't leave. Like, you cannot leave even if you're an American citizen per this executive order. You're physically not allowed to leave this area. So you're going to be locked up here with other people of Japanese descent for the course of the war. You can't leave, and your stuff's being sold off. Again, FDR has reasons for doing it. I think he went way overboard with this. There's certainly not nearly as many spies here. And then what we're going to find with a lot of these Japanese citizens after they get out, they've lost their property. They've lost 3 years of their lives to this internment camp. Imagine if you're a kid thrown in here when you're 11 years old. You're not going to get to go explore. You're not going to get to go have fun with your friends. You're just basically stuck in one of these cabins for the course of this war, and just you basically, your life's put on pause for 3 years. Now, the U.S. government in the 1970s is going to offer reparations to a lot of the Japanese citizens locked up in here, but is this enough to repay? I think it's something like $40,000. Is that enough to replace 3 years of your life where, again, it's essentially put on pause? If you guys know George Takei, the guy that played Sulu in the original Star Trek, he was in one of these things when he was, I think, 5 to 8 years old. So U.S. does this to American citizens, and it's FDR, because he does this per executive order as commander-in-chief. He views this as a military action, so Congress doesn't approve this. So it is all on FDR, and this is one of these things that a lot of people point to and say that this is too much. So these camps will be set up throughout the United States, and we'll actually see the U.S. request its Latin American allies. So as we talked about, the U.S. has political influence in Latin America. So places like Panama, the U.S. will say, send us your Japanese citizens, people of Japanese descent, because we don't want them near the Panama Canal. And so people from Panama, Japanese citizens from Panama, will be sent to the United States and forced to live in these internment camps. All right, so U.S. is dramatically changing at home, dramatically contributing to the war from home. What we'll talk about next time is how the U.S. is going to take the war to Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan.